Hello, everyone, and welcome to, we'll call this Solo Struggles number two. Um, I have been doing a lot of thinking lately, a ton of thinking. You may realize that I'm doing a ton of thinking mostly because I'm not yip yapping with my community in the Gorilla Radio Show Discord. I don't post as much. I am banned from Twitter for the next fucking 5 days, but that doesn't mean anything. It was just merely just the death threats that I was giving to ICE officers, and I'll have to bleep that part out real quick. But anyway, yeah. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and if you have already listened to the newest episode of Red Connections, which came out today, November 19th, which I really hope you do because you kind of need it as a primer for this, there is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I'm calling it a theory of dialogue. I'm sure there's already a theory about it. You know, Marx did consider everything. But it is kind of this concept that while there are, a million different pseudo-analysis of the state of the American left. Huge, I know that's a huge thing. Um, and there are lots of brilliant minds, whether those be from, the DSA, whether they be from the PSL. People are going to shit on me for this, but whether they're in the Revolutionary Communists, the IWW, even God help us, CPUSA, there are brilliant minds amongst all of these organizations who think very hard, who work very, very hard to come up with an analysis for our material conditions in this country, and then attempt to apply Marxism to those things. They attempt to give a Marxist analysis of our material conditions and then present ideas for what does a transition to socialism in this country look like, and how do we get there, and what does that system look like, and in a lot of cases, right, and I'm going to fault myself here too. What does the social aspect of this, the sociological piece of this, how does that work? Where do we go from here? Um, in the United States, there are almost 50 million African Americans, right? There are almost 600 federally recognized, and that's only federally recognized, Native American tribes, right? Not to mention the millions of people who live in this country, work in this country, pay taxes, and do not have documentation that provides them, honestly, in the current state of things, the same rights as a citizen like me, right? We're seeing heightened fascism. The ratchet keeps turning, and it's turning faster, and it's turning tighter than it has in many decades in this country. And so I think one of the biggest challenges facing the American left today is really, how do we communicate with each other? How do we work together to synthesize a if not like a unified ideology? I think that is probably just not in the scope of honestly how people work and how Marxism works, right? Even amongst the Soviet Union, in Maoist China, right? There are myriad factions that existed, and really even like you look prior to the Bolsheviks asserting control in Russia, right? The RSDLP was an organization much like the DSA is in the United States. It spanned everything from, hardcore, what would become Marxist-Leninists, all the way to social democrats like Bernie Sanders, right? At least they're kind of historical equivalents. Now, there was like a marked difference there in that the entire RSDLP, no matter their kind of ideological faction, they were far more open to direct action, we can call it. They were all far more open to it than, maybe the DSA is, right? Than all the factions in the DSA are. But one thing that the RSDLP had, and that the Chinese Communist Party has, and that the Cuban Communist Party, the Cuban Socialist Party, has, and even kind of veering into things that a lot of Marxists may say they're not really socialist projects. There's some sort of kind of social democracy or some sort of authoritarianism with like redistributive characteristics, right? So in that case, we can maybe look for like uh, Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela, or really we can kind of look at maybe Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, right? She is like a social democrat, and she is doing a ton of good for Mexico. But like, I would not call her a Marxist, and I think most Marxists would not call her a Marxist. Regardless, I want that state-owned chocolate bar. Who doesn't, right? And she's trying to build rail, but she's mired in something that, like, I wouldn't even have a fucking inkling of how you get out of that, right? It's almost 150 years of American colonial domination of that country, of its economy, and quite honestly, of half of its fucking territory that it's ours. It's ours now, right? The Mexican American War took Mexico from the biggest country on the continent to the third biggest. Everything, from fucking Texas to Los Angeles was Mexico, right? All the way up to Idaho, that whole swath, right? So we took that. And then, basically since then, they've been dominated by the United States multiple times, in a military sense, most recently in 1915, right? Like 100 years ago. It's not ancient history, it's recent history. It's happening right around the time of World War One, right? If you learned about World War One in school, you learned about the Zimmerman telegram, right? It was a big thing, right? Because the Central Powers tried to get Mexico on side and bring the war to the United States, which, we probably deserved. A lot more going on there, but either way, all of these factions that exist across the United States, I am a dues paying member of the DSA, right? I belong to the Asheville chapter of that organization. And while I agree with most of the members there are still members I don't agree with, right? And we're able to have these very localized internal kind of forums, these debates, where we hear each other's perspectives, we hear each other's interpretations and analyses of Marx, right? Of Marx's writings, and not only of Marx's writings, but of all of his predecessors and all of his successors, right? Predecessors, I think people read a lot less. Most people start with Marx, and I think that that's totally fine because Marx does an excellent job of summarizing, what came before him and what he thinks moving forward, right, into a more scientific method of socialism. In my personal opinion, I think Lenin does the best job of the next generation in terms of, scientific socialism. What becomes Marxism, Leninism, is probably one of the best analyses we have. However, this is kind of the area where I think a lot of modern communists, right? We are modern communists. We get stuck. And it's part of the factionalism that we have in this country, right? Ever since the end of the Red Scares in the 50s, at the end of McCarthyism, the left was really kind of shattered. And the large parties that existed from the early 1900s until World War II, they were mostly destroyed. Their leadership was imprisoned. In some cases, their leadership was killed. They were exiled, and most importantly, and this is the thing we kind of forget, or not really forget, but we take for granted, a lot of the membership of these organizations simply bought in to the American system, right? Because as a byproduct of the New Deal and of post-war prosperity, the social contract in the United States was renegotiated, and it was renegotiated in favor of the working class. For really the first time, it was a ton of concessions were given. Wages were kept high in comparison to inflation and the cost of goods. The silent generation handed their children in the baby boomers the most pro-worker, pro-family, whatever you want to call it, like the best possible conditions for their success. They handed that to them. And I think we all know what the boomers did. Obviously, they pulled the ladder up behind them, they destroyed the economy, and they bet all of our futures on their continued success. They borrowed from the future to make their present better. And now we're living in that future. Now, since they bought in, right? They bought in. The system gave them what they were looking for. That system gave them a home. It gave them security until their old age. It gave them, the ability to move freely, right? The automobile and its explosion with the national highway system and the national interstate system. These things that were built gave people mobility. They gave them cheap transportation. They gave them relatively reliable transportation. They gave them high-paying jobs. They gave them the ability to buy a home, right? Nothing had to be a fancy house, but they gave them the ability to buy their own home, working one job in a household of, 4 or 5 people, right? You could have 2 or 3 kids and a wife who doesn't work, and you could just work some regular job. You could go be a clerk, a fucking clerk in some random office. You'd make enough money to feed everybody, house everybody, send those kids to college if you wanted, or, buy a boat, buy a vacation home someplace, and go on vacation 2 or 3 times a year. And you could smoke in the airplanes. You could smoke on the plane. We got to bring that one back. But really, I think what we're being faced with is we're never going to get those people back. They're out. And so the left for, 20, 30 years wound up being very kind of emaciated, right? Pushed to the edges. And the only people who were left at the edges were the most marginalized in society. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that's Black Americans, right? That's why you see the rise of, the deacons. Well, not only with the Civil Rights Movement, we're just kind of not even addressing the Civil Rights Movement, which already in itself is a huge radicalizing event for Black Americans, right? And for a subset of white Americans who are sympathetic and believe in these things. But the vast majority of white Americans at the time were either ambivalent or against it, right? But you see the deacons of defense, the militancy of the early NAACP, or of the mid-century NAACP, because that's existed for quite a long time. But and the Black Panther Party. That's where Marxism in America went, right? Because the average white American was basically paid off by the federal government to no longer be radical, to let those things go because they were being handed something or being handed a check. Basically a blank check by the government that says, you can have essentially anything you want. Stop bothering us, and don't you dare lift a finger to help your fellow man because he doesn't look like you. And so that's where Marxism went. And that's it's a good thing for the development of American Marxism. And throughout the 60s, and with the Panthers peak in about 1970, by 1975, they're definitely on the decline. That dialogue came back. That thing we had in the early 1900s where the CPUSA and the Socialist Party and the IWW, right? These are people writing polemics against each other, just like Lenin would write back and forth, right? With other, Russian socialists in order to syncretize an ideology, one that they could really apply to Russians, really apply to the early Soviet Union. Those things were happening in the United States. Up until those Red Scares and until the very successful American anti-communist movement really took hold. And in the 1970s, we got that back just a little bit. We got that back, right? So not only do you have the Panthers, and I'm going to stick with just the Panthers when I reference this because they're the most important. They're the most influential, right? And you also have in the 70s the rise of the intellectual socialist groups. I don't want to call them the T word, but direct action proponents, right? You have the SDS, you have the Weather Underground, right? SDS is far less militant than Weather Underground, but those are more kind of predominantly white groups, right? But even they were kind of sparring ideologically with the Panthers. And that progresses the movement. The dialogue is good. Argument is good because you're progressing the movement. If there is a deep, lack of understanding between a position of the Panthers and a position of SDS over here, well, they're going to butt heads. But what they're going to do is they're going to rub against each other, and eventually they're going to come to some sort of common socialist ground, right? Because at the end of the day, everyone is looking for socialism. We're pushing for socialism. We want that change. We want to see that happen. We're all human beings, and especially in the United States, we're a quite atomized society. And so we don't like being told we're wrong, I don't like being told I'm wrong. And I get it. And we had that. And then, the 70s, the real right-wing crackdown, especially just with the advent of neoliberalism itself, it really changed everything. The remnants of CPUSA, the remnants of SDS, the remnants of the IWW, the remnants of the Socialist Party, these things, they kind of fell apart. They fell by the wayside because, like, just the right-wing crackdown was so intense in the late 70s and through the 90s, right? The Black Panther Party was destroyed not only through assassination and imprisonment, but through the very purposeful introduction of cheap, highly addictive, and life-destroying drugs into black communities. That is just a fact. It is just a thing we know. It is a thing that has been admitted to. We know that's what happened. And it was part of destroying the Panther movement. It was. Um, it was purpose built to keep black Americans from getting too far ahead. And that was the kind of destruction that we saw. And then there's this kind of dead period, right? The collapse of the Soviet Union destroys a lot of the institutions that are left for the socialist and communist parties in the United States, right? Not that they were being supported by the Soviet Union, but really that they were modeling themselves, on the CPSU. They were modeling themselves on the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and there were obviously some major splits, some parties that did not want to do that did not believe in that, but really that kind of collapse in on itself kind of fucked up the left a lot. And then there's something very important that happens in this time while there is no unified leftism. And that's the introduction of the internet. The internet has changed the way we dialogue. For better or worse, it is here. It has changed the way that we communicate with one another. And I think that, in my opinion, it is why the existing left organizations in this country today do not communicate well and do not write long polemics against each other and really argue and hold conferences and debate, right? The communists of the early 20th century, they were riding on a fucking train for a week from one side of that continent to the fucking other to go argue with another guy in some, let's be honest, shit-ass Baltic city for the most part. So we don't have that anymore. We don't, because now the place where this happens is Twitter. Or it happens in a siloed off online only newspaper, right? I know we make fun of the Trotskyists a lot for their fucking newspaper habits, but the newspapers are probably a good thing because you can argue in them. We should be arguing. We should be railing against each other. We should be trying to convince other socialists to work on their ideological positions. If we don't, then we don't build a good analysis, right? If you asked the smartest member of the DSA, you gave them, time. You gave them time, you paid them a salary, and you told them, we want you to write an analysis of America's material conditions. And then you did the same thing to the smartest person in the PSL, and the smartest person in the RCA, and the smartest person amongst one of the Maoist groups, and the smartest person, fuck it, even in the goddamn ACP, right? You're going to get 10 different analyses of material conditions. They're all in the same country, but because each individual in those organizations come from different backgrounds and different class positions, right? You're going to get different analyses, which means that when you say, all right, well then how do we transition to socialism based on your analysis, right? And that is the ideology part. You're going to get 10 different ways, right? And then that's it. They go their separate ways. Everybody's trying to implement socialism their way and their way only, which is the fucking problem, right? The DSA doesn't appeal to anyone who makes less than $65,000 a year. Let's be real. The PSL does not appeal to anybody who makes more than $40,000 a year. Okay? The RCA, I don't know who they really appeal to. The ACP, they appeal to kind of like chudded leftist Joe Rogans. I don't know. The chudded dudes who like the aesthetics, which for what it's worth, I don't know, hand those guys a rifle, tell them to march towards a trench. But like everybody appeals to a different group with very minimal crossover, if we're being fair. If we're being honest, very minimal crossover exists between these different organizations. Which is why, in my opinion, there should be a conference. Now I'm just one guy. I'm nobody. But there should be a conference. I think that there should be something where these organizations meet, one representative per organization, and they sit down and they hash out an agreement, much like the RSDLP did, in order to form a united front within the Russian Empire, right? The RSDLP was made up of 4 or 5 different organizations. The Jewish Bund, the Labor, I think it was called the Labor Party. They've got some different names. But it's made up of multiple different organizations that did not agree with each other on 50% of the ideological problems, right? What they did agree on was SAR bad, socialism good, we should push for socialism. That's it. Those are your unifying concepts. We don't have a czar. We've got Donald Trump, right? And we probably shouldn't just base it on one guy. We should base it on American republicanism, bad. And I do not mean the party. I mean our system of government. Our system of government. Capitalism, bad. It's not hard. It's not hard to do. But our organizations don't do that. And why? And why? If you ask me, I think it's a combination of ego, of fear of losing, and that's important because the DSA, I mean, they actually are probably the most successful socialist org in quite a long time, right? We have multiple elected officials in the government. Those people's success rates is very fucking debatable, but like, it's this fear of if we join forces in a coalition and form a larger party, form our own RSDLP, right? Whatever we want to call it. We can call it the American Socialist Party for all I care. They're afraid of doing that and then losing momentum, losing time, and in a lot of cases for the people at the very top of these organizations, losing their personal influence, right? If you are one of the co-chairs of New York City DSA, you wield a lot of power, a lot of real power, a lot of like real soft power in the politics of the organization as a whole, right? And if you enter willingly, if you enter into coalition with New York City PSL, which also like wields a decent amount of power, like that's a pretty big organization, you're gonna have to share that power, and you're gonna have to be wrong sometimes, because now you're in coalition. You're not in different organizations working together where you can still be separate. You're in one organization. You're merging your leadership. You got to put yourself up to a vote, and you got to prove to yourself to people who are honestly a lot more hardcore in terms of their ideology than you might be. And so you don't want to do that. Now you're going to push against that. You're going to say, no, 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 no. We're the vanguard. And then, but every organization is doing that. Everybody's going, no, 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 no. We're the vanguard. We're the vanguard. That is not how the vanguard works. The vanguard is an advanced detachment of the working class. You're not the working class, right? If you're doing this full time, you are now a member of the intellectual class, right? You might be poor, but your job is to do politics. You do not labor. Not in the same way. Not in the same way. And you have become a politician in many ways. You want to do the politics. And that's fine. That's all well and good. We need many a politician, right? If we're going to have a socialist republic in this country, we need politicians. But we're never going to get there if you can't swallow your pride. And this is for everyone. Everyone needs to swallow their pride and come together in that way, right? And I mean, as many of the organizations that are fucking willing, right? And if that means Jackson Hinkle and the ACP want to come and sit down and join the coalition, well, by God, you might as well hear them out. You might as well hear them fucking out. If we're doing ideological purity tests, not only on people outside the org who are vying for endorsements from our organizations, but internally, constantly doing purity tests, well, the organization is going to cap out. You can't make it bigger because not everybody is going to match your fucking thing. Do you think all 90,000 DSA members agree politically? I could probably walk into my local DSA meeting, say something, and have half the room disagree with me, even though what I'm saying might be a direct quote from Lenin. If somebody doesn't agree with me and they believe a direct quote from Kautsky, we're going to argue. But that's a good thing, because we're all united in our struggle. What does a forum look like? What does that look like? You know, there was a vibrant community in Russia and in China and in Cuba. There's this vibrant community of leftist writing, of leftist thought, that we don't have anymore. A lot of us have lost our ability to truly sit down and write, and really just hammer something out. And as just like everybody else, we're victims of the technological progress or regression of our age, in that, you know, short form media content has overtaken a lot of our brains, and, you know, arguing on Twitter in, 280 character length tweets, That's a lot easier than like writing an essay about why you disagree with someone. It's easier to say you're stupid and gay and I think your ideology's bad, than it is to really give a well thought out reasoning as to why you disagree and why you think it should be your way. And it's part of why we haven't come up with a really good, you know, cohesive, you know, in coalition analysis, and then an ideology on top of that analysis that allows us to implement socialism in this country. And if I could press a magic button, what I would do is get leadership for all these orgs in one room, um, and have them hammer out a fucking agreement. And then the second thing is I would be in, highly, intensively promoting writing in my organization. I want to hear from I want to hear from the guy who just joined DSA, or the girl who just joined DSA, or the non-binary who just joined DSA, right? I want to hear what their positions are. Write it down. Write it in an essay. Let's debate it. Maybe you're coming into an organization with 10 years of Marxist experience behind you, or 40 years, or 30 years, or 4 days. Tell me what you think. If you could implement socialism tomorrow, how would you do it? I want to know. I want to know how you would implement Marxism tomorrow. How do you make a country like this one that is at the center of the capitalist global economy? How do you not only prevent a reactionary counter-revolution or defeat it when it comes, and then how do you equitably raise up all 380 million of us in this country, right? How do you give these people a better quality of life? How do you give them the education necessary to maintain that, right? A good example of this is like there is a minimal public housing in this country. And a common complaint you see from right-wingers is, well, they destroy it. We give people public housing and it gets destroyed. But why does it get destroyed? Well, part of it is that education is just gone. If you hand someone who didn't finish high school a house, if you hand them a house, they didn't finish high school, they've been just kind of not working this whole time, or they've been forced to resort to becoming involved in an illegal trade, like the drug trade, or joining a gang, right? You give them a house, and then you tell them you have to pay us $1,000 a month in rent, right? Whatever the subsidized amount is. All right. Well, they don't have a job still, and if they're on unemployment, they're getting like $200 a week, and that's not forever. You don't get that forever. Well, what do you think they're gonna do? They're gonna not be able to pay fucking rent. First off, they're gonna have to resort to crime to get the money to pay the rent. And then if they can't afford the fucking electricity bill, well, come wintertime, well, they're not going to leave their fucking house, but they are going to burn their furniture in the fireplace, right? Or they're going to have to leave the oven on and open the fucking oven door to heat their house, right? And that's why that gets destroyed, because there's no education, there's no jobs, there's no nothing. America gives you 1/4 of the welfare state that we should have, and then wonders why that 1/4 gets just decimated, just destroyed. I lost my train of thought here. I completely lost my train of thought. I'm just going to go back. We need to force a dialogue, and I want to hear how you're implementing socialism, right? That's what I was talking about. How do you do it? How? Tell me how. I don't know how. I have ideas. I have thoughts, and I'm trying to start writing them down. I am trying to start getting those things on paper, right? And you know what, everybody makes fun of these people, and for good reason a lot of the time. But it's free to make a Substack account and write down what you're thinking and post it so that people can read it. And you don't have to use your real name. I'm not using my fucking full name on this shit. Check out my Substack at Uwharrie, right? UWHARRIE. Uwharrie. But anyway, go write down what you think. I want to know if we're going to promote anything in our socialist organizations at this point. Because doing fucking charity and being tailists to every social movement, well, that's not working. Promote fucking writing. Promote writing in the organization. I don't need to go to a general meeting and just we go over the same shit, and then in reality nothing on the ground is changing. Promote writing. Tell people, let's sit down and write together. Let's sit down and have an open forum, an open debate about our ideologies and about how we would implement change and how we would bring about a just world, right? Because this is not, let me try and give an example. If a socialist revolution were to occur in, hmm, in Australia tomorrow, right? That's kind of a close cultural thing. Um, they don't have an international empire like us, right? Australia kind of historically dominates some Polynesian, southern Polynesia, some of those countries down there. Um, but there's a lot less, and it's not like Australia has this massive troop presence around the world. All right, if you implement socialism in America tomorrow, what are you going to do with the 150,000 American troops who are just like all over the world doing neo-colonialism? How do you extricate the United States from that while you're uplifting the American people? Do something with all of those soldiers, right? You have to do something. You can't just. Some of them are going to be. Look, a good chunk of the U.S. military is incredibly right wing, so expect counter-revolution. What do you do with America's nuclear weapons? What do you do about America's international alliances? What do you do with the $38 trillion in debt that the United States has? What do you do when implementing socialism would likely crash the global capitalist system and immiserate billions of people? How do you deal with that? How do you mitigate what you can? How do you provide support to the fucking southern hemisphere, which we have brutally raped as a country? What do you do if you pull all American money out tomorrow, right? This was the argument like the left had about USAID. And it was a good argument. And like, USAID is like a bad program in that we're using it to do spy shit and destabilize other countries. But in a lot of ways, it's the only way millions of people were getting food and medicine around the world. That's how they got their food and medicine, was from USAID. It was from donated food from US farmers and donated medication from US pharmacological manufacturers. That's how they were getting their shit. Well, what do we do, right? Because if we crash the capitalist system overnight, well, this ain't going to be a rich country no more, right? There's going to be a harsh readjustment period. And quite honestly, some sort of reindustrialization is necessary, right? The United States is the finance capital of the world. We have a majority service economy. Manufacturing's gone, right? Now, obviously, I think if we had a socialist revolution tomorrow, I think China's still going to be our trading partner. But like, what do we do with other stuff? What do we do? What do we do about luxuries? What do we do about staple goods, right? How much of our food comes from overseas? What do you do? I want to know. I want to hear a fucking thorough and in-depth analysis. This is the type of shit that Lenin was talking about, that Mao talks about, that Che and Castro talk about. How do we fucking deal with it when we do win? When we do win. Because we will win. That is inevitable, right? Capital goes through these cycles and eventually it crashes low enough that we win. And we will win. And we will build a better future not only for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children. And hopefully they keep building it too, into a more equitable world. But we really need to start writing. All of us. I'm writing right now. And I think that's a good first step for me, right? I work a shit-ass job. A shit-ass job. I got laid off from my good job, right? I went from being what a DSA member normally is to what like a Maoist normally is in terms of the fucking incomes of the members of those groups, right? I'm struggling. I made promises that are hard to keep. I don't want to struggle. I feel like I deserve a life of dignity. A life of dignity and free of struggle, if I can. The only struggle I want in my life is a political one. I want to politically struggle with my comrades for something better. If you're at home and you don't really know what to do with all of this shit, with the way that things are, and the way that things feel, well, take solace in the fact that you're not alone in that feeling, and that there are millions of us all around the country and all around the world that are feeling the same way. So I want you at home, right now, or as soon as you can. I'm not your boss. I want you to write down something. Anything. Just write what you feel about Marxism, what you feel about socialism, what you feel about communism, and maybe give me 2 or 3 sentences on how you think we're going to get there. And what does it look like when we're there? Your ideas. I want to hear your ideas. And truly, if there is anybody actually listening to this fucking show, I want you to write that stuff down, and I want you to email it to me, and I will leave you anonymous if you wish. If you don't want to be left anonymous, tell me that. But I'm going to, by default, anonymize all of you. And I'm going to write something, a little article. I'm going to write an article about it. And next time we record an episode with myself and John, I will bring it up. We'll talk about it. And we'll try to synthesize a little bit. Because I want to hear what you guys think. Where do you come from? And don't be afraid about your writing style or your prose or if you sound smart enough. I promise it doesn't matter. You should see the shit I do. My first drafts, usually the thing I think is good, I publish. People are like, yeah, this look reads really bad because I'm bad at punctuation. I over comma everything. I'm very run-on sentences. It's a lot like the way I talk is how I write. So don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. I'll clean up your punctuation if it's necessary. But I want to hear from you. So please send me an email with that shit to redconnections1917@gmail.com. Send it to me there, just written format. Tell me if you want to be anonymous or not. If you do, you do. If you don't, you don't. Send me a DM on Twitter at Red Connections. Now the 3 in Red Connections, not the 3 in Red Connections. The E in red is a 3 in Red Connections. Or if you communicate with us on the Gorilla Radio Show podcast Discord, feel free to shoot me a DM there, or throw it in the hashtag Substack chat. And I will include it there. I'm really, 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 really looking forward to hearing from you guys. I kind of like doing these little solo struggles, right? I can't do them all the time, obviously. I have a life, I have a job, I've got a fiance, I've got things to do. I'm mainly doing this today because I'm homesick because I threw my fucking back out. It hurts like a motherfucker. So I'm here. But yeah, thank you all for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week. And I am looking forward to hearing from you all soon. Thank you. Goodbye.